Sarah Martinez stood at the entrance of the luxury hotel ballroom, adjusting the simple black dress she had chosen for her high school reunion. 20 years had passed since she graduated from Lincoln High, and tonight she would see faces from a past that felt like another lifetime. Her calloused hands, evidence of years of military service, smoothed down the fabric as she took a deep breath. The ballroom buzzed with conversations and laughter. Former classmates mingled in small groups, their voices carrying across the elegant space decorated with school colors and memories from their teenage years. Sarah noticed how many of her old classmates had changed, some barely recognizable, others looking exactly as they had 2 decades ago. She made her way to the registration table where a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive jewelry sat checking names off a list. Sarah recognized her immediately, Jennifer Walsh, who had been head cheerleader and prom queen. Jennifer had married the quarterback right after graduation and now lived in the wealthiest part of town. "Sarah Martinez," Sarah said with a polite smile, approaching the table. Jennifer looked up from her clipboard, her eyes scanning Sarah from head to toe with obvious judgment. The smile on Jennifer's face was cold and calculating. "Oh my, Sarah Martinez. I almost didn't recognize you. You look so different." 20 years will do that to a person, Sarah replied calmly, maintaining her composure despite the obvious condescension in Jennifer's voice. Jennifer's friends gathered around the registration table, forming a small circle of women who had clearly maintained their high school social hierarchy well into their adult lives. Among them was Rebecca Stone, who had been Jennifer's closest friend and equally popular. Rebecca wore designer clothes and carried a purse that probably cost more than some people's monthly salary. "So Sarah, what have you been doing with yourself all these years?" Rebecca asked, her tone suggesting she already assumed the answer would be disappointing. "I heard you joined the military or something like that." Sarah nodded. "I've been serving in the Navy for the past 18 years. The group exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the subtle smirks forming on their faces. She had expected this reaction. In their small town, military service was often viewed as a last resort for people who couldn't succeed in other areas of life. Jennifer laughed, a sound that carried no warmth. "Oh, that's nice. Playing sailor for all these years. I suppose that's better than some alternatives." She turned to her friends with an exaggerated whisper that was clearly meant for Sarah to hear. "Remember how she was always so serious and unfriendly in school? I guess the military was perfect for her." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being underestimated and dismissed. She had experienced this type of treatment before, both in her civilian life and, unfortunately, even within military circles where some people still questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. But she had learned long ago that actions spoke louder than words. "The Navy has been very good to me," Sarah said simply, refusing to take the bait or engage in the petty behavior that these women seemed to expect. Rebecca joined in with another cutting remark. "Well, at least you found something you could stick with. I remember you were never very good at anything in school. Always so quiet and weird." She gestured toward Sarah's dress and simple appearance. "I see you're still keeping things basic." The group laughed together, and Sarah noticed several other reunion attendees turning to watch the interaction. Some faces showed curiosity, others showed the uncomfortable recognition of bullying behavior that hadn't changed since high school. Sarah's military training had taught her discipline and emotional control in far more challenging situations than this. She had faced enemy fire, led teams through dangerous missions, and made split-second decisions that saved lives. A group of shallow women trying to relive their high school glory days was hardly a threat. "Everyone has different paths in life," Sarah responded diplomatically. "I'm proud of my service and the experiences it's given me." Jennifer's expression became even more mocking. "Oh, I'm sure you're proud. But, let's be honest, Sarah. Some of us went on to build real lives, successful lives. Look around this room." She gestured grandly toward the crowd of well-dressed former classmates. "People here are doctors, lawyers, business owners, successful mothers. They are contributing to society in meaningful ways." The implication was clear. Jennifer and her friends viewed Sarah's military service as somehow less valuable or important than their civilian achievements. This attitude stung more than Sarah cared to admit, not because she doubted her own worth, but because it represented a broader lack of understanding and respect for military sacrifice. Rebecca added fuel to the fire. "I mean, how hard can it really be? Following orders and doing what you're told? It's not exactly rocket science." Her friends nodded in agreement, clearly enjoying what they saw as an intellectual superiority over their former classmate. Sarah could have ended this conversation in several ways. She could have walked away, which was probably the mature thing to do. She could have defended herself with facts about her accomplishments and service record. Or she could have revealed the truth about her actual role and achievements in the military, which would have certainly surprised these women. Instead, she chose a different approach. Sarah had learned that sometimes the best response to ignorance was patience. Let people reveal their true character while maintaining your own dignity and integrity. "You might be surprised by what military service involves," Sarah said calmly. "But I don't expect everyone to understand." Jennifer seized on what she perceived as weakness in Sarah's measured response. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a more personal, aggressive tone. "Don't patronize us, Sarah. We all know that people who can't make it in the real world end up in the military. It's like a safety net for people who can't handle real responsibility or real challenges." The conversation was attracting more attention now. Other reunion attendees had begun to form a loose circle around the registration table, some clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the discussion but unwilling to intervene. Sarah recognized some faces in the growing crowd. There was Michael Chen, who had been student body president and was now a successful doctor. There was Lisa Rodriguez, who had been valedictorian and now ran her own accounting firm. These were people Sarah respected, people who had worked hard to build meaningful careers and lives. But she also saw others who seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. Former classmates who had been part of Jennifer's social circle in high school were watching with obvious amusement, as if they were witnessing some form of entertainment rather than a fellow human being subjected to disrespect. Rebecca decided to escalate the situation further. "You know what, Jennifer? I think Sarah here thinks she's better than us because she wears a uniform. Like that somehow makes her special or important." She looked directly at Sarah with undisguised contempt. "News flash, sweetie, wearing camouflage doesn't make you a hero." The crowd grew quieter, sensing that the conversation had crossed a line from mere rudeness into something more serious. Sarah felt the familiar surge of controlled anger that she had learned to manage during her years of service. But she also felt something else, disappointment that people she had once known could be so casually cruel and dismissive. Sarah's training had prepared her for many challenging situations, but one of the most valuable lessons she had learned was when to engage and when to maintain strategic patience. This was clearly a situation that called for the latter approach. "I've never claimed to be better than anyone," Sarah said quietly. "I'm simply here to reconnect with old classmates and maybe catch up with some friends." Jennifer's response revealed just how far she was willing to take her cruelty. "Friends? Sarah, let's be honest about your high school experience. You didn't have friends then, and, based on what I'm seeing now, I doubt much has changed." She turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Remember how Sarah used to eat lunch alone? How she never got invited to parties or social events? Some things never change." The personal attack cut deeper than the professional insults had. Sarah remembered those lonely lunch periods, the feeling of being an outsider looking in at social groups that seemed impenetrable. She remembered the hurt of being excluded from gatherings that everyone else seemed to know about but somehow she never heard about until after they had happened. But she also remembered how those experiences had shaped her character, teaching her self-reliance and inner strength that had served her well throughout her military career. The loneliness of high school had prepared her for the isolation that sometimes came with leadership positions and difficult assignments. Rebecca, emboldened by Jennifer's personal attack, decided to join in with her own cruel observation. "At least we all knew our place in the social order back then. Some people were leaders, some were followers, and some were just irrelevant." She looked directly at Sarah as she spoke the last word. The crowd was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Several people had begun to shift away from the registration area, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the bullying behavior they were witnessing. Michael Chen, the former student body president who was now a successful doctor, stepped forward slightly. His expression showed disapproval of what he was seeing, and, for a moment Sarah thought he might say something to defend her or at least change the subject. But, before Michael could speak, Jennifer made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of the evening. She had been riding high on what she perceived as social dominance over Sarah, enjoying the feeling of superiority and control that came from publicly humiliating someone she viewed as beneath her. Looking directly at Sarah with a mixture of contempt and cruel satisfaction, Jennifer gathered saliva in her mouth and spat directly in Sarah's face. The ballroom fell completely silent. The casual conversations that had been providing background noise throughout the room stopped abruptly. Even the hotel staff members who had been moving through the crowd serving drinks paused in their duties. Sarah stood perfectly still as the saliva dripped down her cheek. Her military training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to assess threats and respond appropriately rather than react emotionally. But this wasn't a battlefield situation requiring tactical analysis, this was a moment of pure personal disrespect that demanded a response. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Sarah slowly reached up and wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her expression remained calm and controlled, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a cold, professional assessment that suggested the dynamic of the situation had fundamentally changed. Jennifer stood there with a satisfied smirk on her face, clearly believing she had delivered the ultimate insult and humiliation. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she seemed to think she had emerged victorious from the encounter. Rebecca and the other women in Jennifer's circle stood frozen, suddenly realizing that their friend had gone too far. The cruel words and social bullying had been bad enough, but the physical act of spitting on someone crossed into territory that even they recognized as serious. Sarah looked around the room at the faces staring back at her. Some showed shock, others showed disgust at Jennifer's behavior, and a few showed what appeared to be concern for what might happen next. She could see that many of her former classmates were finally beginning to understand the true character of the woman they had allowed to dominate this social gathering. "That was a mistake," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a new tone. Sarah Martinez reached into her small purse and pulled out her phone. The simple action caused the crowd to watch with renewed attention, wondering if she was calling for help or perhaps documenting the incident for some kind of formal complaint. Jennifer and her friends assumed she was probably calling her husband or a friend to come pick her up, admitting defeat in their cruel social game. Instead, Sarah opened her contacts and found a number she hadn't called in several months. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Admiral Morrison's office, this is Commander Phillips speaking." "Commander Phillips, this is Commander Martinez. I need to speak with Admiral Morrison if he's available." The crowd couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but they could see the respectful way Sarah spoke and the obvious military bearing in her posture as she made the call. Some people began to exchange confused glances, wondering why she was using military titles and speaking with such authority. "Sarah. Good to hear from you. The Admiral is actually here in his office working late. Hold on one moment." Within seconds, another voice came on the line, deeper, older, carrying the unmistakable authority of senior military leadership. "Commander Martinez, this is Admiral Morrison. How are you doing? I hope everything is all right." "Admiral, I'm fine, sir. I'm currently at my high school reunion, and I find myself in a situation where I need to clarify my service record and current status for some civilians who seem to have misconceptions about military service." The crowd listened in growing confusion and concern as Sarah's conversation continued. Jennifer's smirk began to fade as she realized that Sarah wasn't making the kind of phone call she had expected. "I see." Admiral Morrison's voice carried a tone that suggested he understood exactly what kind of situation Sarah was describing. "Would you like me to provide some background information about your service record and current assignment?" "That would be helpful, sir." There seem to be some people here who believe military service is for people who can't handle real responsibility or real challenges. A few people in the crowd winced at hearing their own prejudices reflected back at them through Sarah's calm recounting of the situation. Admiral Morrison's voice became more formal, taking on the tone he used for official briefings. Commander Sarah Martinez is a highly decorated officer in the United States Navy with 18 years of distinguished service. She completed Navy SEAL training as part of the first class to include female candidates and has served with honor in multiple combat deployments. Sarah held the phone slightly away from her ear so that people nearby could hear the Admiral's words. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversation stopped, and people pressed closer to listen. Commander Martinez has led multiple high-risk operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, including the successful rescue of captured American personnel and the elimination of high-value enemy targets. She has been awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with V for Valor, and the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. Jennifer's face had gone completely white. The other women in her group looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. The crowd of former classmates stood in stunned silence as they began to realize exactly who they had been watching be humiliated and disrespected. Admiral Morrison continued with obvious pride in his voice. Currently, Commander Martinez serves as senior instructor at the Navy's Special Warfare Advanced Training Command, where she is responsible for training the next generation of Navy SEALs. She is considered one of the most capable and respected special operations officers in the United States military. Sarah thanked the Admiral and ended the call. She looked around the room at the shocked faces staring back at her. The same people who had been watching her be mocked and humiliated just minutes earlier were now seeing her in a completely different light. I didn't mention my background earlier because I don't believe in using my service record to impress people or gain respect, Sarah said to the silent crowd. I believe respect should be earned through character and actions, not through titles or achievements. Michael Chen, the former student body president who was now a doctor, stepped forward with obvious embarrassment about what he had witnessed. Sarah, we had no idea. I'm sorry we didn't speak up when you were being treated so poorly. Sarah nodded graciously. Not everyone is aware of what military service involves, and that's understandable. But disrespecting any service member based on ignorance and prejudice is unacceptable. She turned to look directly at Jennifer, who was standing frozen beside the registration table. The arrogant confidence that had characterized her behavior just minutes earlier had completely evaporated. Jennifer, you made several statements about military service that show a fundamental misunderstanding of what we do and why we do it. You suggested that people join the military because they can't handle real responsibility or real challenges. Sarah's voice remained calm and professional, but her words carried weight that made everyone in the room listen carefully. Let me explain what real responsibility looks like. Real responsibility is leading a team of highly trained operators into enemy territory to rescue hostages, knowing that any mistake you make could result in the death of innocent people. Real responsibility is making split-second decisions in combat situations where the wrong choice means your teammates don't come home to their families. The crowd listened in complete silence as Sarah continued. Real challenges aren't about social dynamics or business competition. Real challenges are operating under enemy fire while treating wounded comrades, or maintaining operational effectiveness after being wounded yourself. Real challenges are earning the trust and respect of the most elite military units in the world through years of training and proven performance in life-or-death situations. Jennifer tried to speak, her voice shaking. Sarah, I didn't know. We thought. Sarah held up a hand to stop her. What you thought was based on prejudice and ignorance, not fact. But that's not the most serious problem here. She stepped closer to Jennifer, her military bearing now fully apparent to everyone watching. The quiet, unassuming woman who had been accepting abuse just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a confident special operations officer who commanded respect through presence alone. The most serious problem is that you felt entitled to spit in the face of another human being based on your assumptions about their worth and status. That action reveals your true character more clearly than anything else you could have done. The crowd murmured in agreement, and several people nodded their heads. Jennifer's cruel behavior was being recognized for what it truly was, and the social dynamics in the room had completely reversed. Rebecca, who had been equally cruel in her comments, tried to distance herself from the situation. "Jennifer, I can't believe you actually spat on her. That's completely unacceptable regardless of. I mean, no matter who she is or what she does." But Sarah wasn't going to let any of them escape responsibility for their behavior. "Rebecca, you were equally disrespectful. You mocked military service and suggested that following orders doesn't require intelligence or skill. You participated in trying to humiliate someone based on your prejudiced assumptions." Sarah's direct challenge forced Rebecca to face her own behavior instead of hiding behind Jennifer's more extreme actions. "Let me address your comment about following orders," Sarah continued. "Navy SEALs don't just follow orders blindly. We analyze complex situations, adapt to changing conditions, and make independent decisions when communication with command is impossible. We lead other elite operators and coordinate with multiple military and civilian agencies." The educational tone in Sarah's voice made it clear that she was taking the opportunity to correct dangerous misconceptions about military service. Every SEAL must be capable of independent command, advanced tactical planning, and split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. The training to reach this level involves some of the most challenging physical and mental testing ever developed. The failure rate exceeds 90% because the standards are so demanding. Lisa Rodriguez, the former valedictorian who now ran her own accounting firm, stepped forward with obvious respect and curiosity. "Sarah, I had no idea that Navy SEALs included women. When did that change?" Sarah appreciated the genuine interest in Lisa's question, which provided an opportunity to educate rather than simply defend. The Navy opened SEAL training to women in 2016, but the standards remained exactly the same. Every candidate, regardless of gender, must meet identical physical, mental, and professional requirements. No accommodations are made, and no standards are lowered. She looked around the room at the faces watching her with growing understanding and respect. "I was part of the first class to include female candidates. Out of the initial group of 12 women who attempted the program, I was the only one to complete training and earn the SEAL designation. It took me 3 attempts over 2 years, but I refused to quit." The room buzzed with quiet conversations as people processed this information. Many of them were beginning to understand that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. They had watched someone try to humiliate one of the most elite military operators in the world. Michael Chen spoke up again, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Sarah, that's incredible. The mental and physical strength required for that kind of training. I can't even imagine." "The training is designed to test every aspect of human performance and character," Sarah replied. "But the real test comes when you're deployed and responsible for the lives of your teammates and the success of critical missions." She paused and looked directly at Jennifer again. "Which brings us back to the issue of respect and character. In the military, we judge people based on their actions, their reliability under pressure, and their commitment to something larger than themselves. We don't judge people based on their background, their appearance, or their social status." Jennifer finally managed to speak, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I never would have." Sarah's expression didn't soften. "You never would have what, Jennifer? Spat in my face if you had known I was a Navy SEAL? But you felt it was acceptable to spit on someone you thought was just a regular service member." The question hung in the air, forcing Jennifer to confront the ugly truth about her behavior and attitudes. "The rank or position of a service member doesn't determine whether they deserve basic human respect," Sarah continued. "Every person who serves in our military, regardless of their job or rank, has volunteered to potentially sacrifice their life for their country. They all deserve better than your ignorance and contempt." Several veterans in the crowd stepped forward, including a man Sarah recognized as Tommy Walsh, no relation to Jennifer, who had served in the army. His expression showed both anger at what he had witnessed and gratitude that someone had finally spoken up for military service members. "Sarah's absolutely right," Tommy said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. What happened here tonight is exactly the kind of disrespect that military families deal with from people who have no understanding of service or sacrifice. Other veterans began identifying themselves and expressing their support for Sarah's response to the situation. The social dynamics in the room had completely shifted, with the veterans and their supporters clearly aligned against the cruel behavior they had witnessed. Jennifer looked around desperately for support from her friends, but found none. Even her closest allies were distancing themselves from her extreme behavior, recognizing that public opinion had turned strongly against her. The hotel manager's intervention brought a new level of seriousness to the situation. What had begun as social cruelty at a high school reunion had escalated into a potential legal matter involving assault and battery charges. The manager addressed Jennifer directly. Spitting on another person constitutes assault under state law. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately, and the hotel reserves the right to pursue criminal charges. Jennifer's husband, Robert Walsh, who had been across the room socializing with other former football players, hurried over when he heard the commotion. As a successful lawyer, he immediately understood the legal implications of what his wife had done. What happened here? He asked, looking between his wife's pale face and the crowd of people staring at them with obvious disapproval. Tommy Walsh, the Army veteran, stepped forward to explain. Your wife just spat in the face of a decorated Navy SEAL because she thought military service was for people who couldn't succeed in civilian life. Robert's expression shifted from confusion to horror as he processed this information. As a lawyer, he understood both the legal ramifications of assault charges and the public relations nightmare that his wife had created for their family. Jennifer, please tell me that's not true, he said quietly, but his wife's inability to meet his eyes confirmed his worst fears. Sarah stepped forward, her military bearing evident in every movement. Mr. Walsh, your wife not only committed assault, but she did so after making deeply insulting statements about military service and service members. She suggested that people who serve in the military are failures who couldn't handle real responsibility. Robert closed his eyes briefly, understanding that his wife had created a situation that would have serious consequences for their family's reputation in their small town. As a prominent lawyer married to someone who was supposed to be a community leader, this incident would become public knowledge very quickly. Sarah, I apologize profusely for my wife's behavior, Robert said formally. There is no excuse for what she did, and I assure you that there will be consequences. But Sarah wasn't interested in apologies from family members who hadn't been involved in the incident. Mr. Walsh, I appreciate your words, but your wife is an adult who made her own choices tonight. She needs to take responsibility for her actions and understand why they were so deeply wrong. She turned her attention back to Jennifer, who was still standing frozen beside the registration table. Jennifer, do you understand what you've done here tonight? Jennifer tried to speak but could only manage a few broken words. I'm sorry. I didn't know. You didn't know what? Sarah pressed. You didn't know I was a Navy SEAL, or you didn't know that spitting on another human being is wrong regardless of who they are or what they do for a living. The distinction was important, and everyone in the room understood it. Sarah was forcing Jennifer to confront whether she was sorry for her actions or simply sorry that she had chosen the wrong target for her cruelty. Jennifer's silence was answer enough for most people watching. Michael Chen, who had been standing nearby throughout the confrontation, decided to take action. As a respected doctor in the community and someone who had maintained his integrity since high school, his voice carried weight with many of the reunion attendees. I think everyone here has seen enough to understand what kind of person Jennifer really is, he announced to the crowd. Her behavior tonight has been absolutely disgusting, and I for one don't want to spend another minute in her company. Several other classmates voiced their agreement, and people began turning away from Jennifer and her group of friends. The social ostracism was swift and decisive. Within minutes, she had gone from being the center of attention to being actively avoided by most of the reunion attendees. Lisa Rodriguez approached Sarah with obvious respect and curiosity. Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what's it like being a Navy SEAL? I've never met anyone in special operations before. Sarah appreciated the genuine interest and saw an opportunity to educate people about military service in a more positive context. The training is incredibly demanding, both physically and mentally, she began. But the real reward comes from serving with some of the most dedicated and capable people in the world. Navy SEALs are united by a commitment to excellence and to each other that goes beyond anything I experienced in civilian life. Other classmates gathered around to listen as Sarah continued. We train constantly to maintain our skills and readiness. Physical fitness, weapons proficiency, tactical planning, medical training, language skills, everything has to be maintained at the highest level because lives depend on our competence. Tommy Walsh nodded in understanding. That's similar to what I experienced in the Army, though obviously not at the SEAL level. The bonds you form with people who are willing to risk everything for the mission and for each other, there's nothing like it in civilian life. Sarah smiled at Tommy, appreciating his understanding. Exactly. And that's why what happened here tonight is so offensive. It's not just disrespect toward me personally, it's disrespect toward everyone who serves and everyone who has made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. The educational conversation was having a powerful effect on the crowd. People who had never really thought deeply about military service were beginning to understand the dedication, skill, and sacrifice involved. Dr. James Patterson, a former classmate who had become a prominent surgeon, stepped forward with obvious admiration. Sarah, the precision and decision-making skills required for special operations must translate well to leadership in other areas. What are you doing now that you're training other SEALs? Sarah appreciated the intelligent question. I'm responsible for advanced tactical training and combat leadership development. I work with experienced operators who are preparing for the most challenging missions our military undertakes. She paused and looked around the room at the faces listening to her. The training I provide could mean the difference between life and death for these operators and the people they are trying to protect or rescue. It's a responsibility I take very seriously, and it requires constant learning and adaptation to new threats and challenges. The contrast between Sarah's actual responsibilities and Jennifer's assumptions about military service couldn't have been more stark. While Jennifer had assumed military personnel simply followed orders without thinking, Sarah was actually responsible for training elite operators to think independently and make complex decisions under extreme pressure. Rebecca, who had been standing silently since the revelation of Sarah's true background, finally found the courage to speak. Sarah, I owe you a personal apology. My comments about military service were ignorant and hurtful. I based my opinions on stereotypes instead of facts, and I participated in trying to humiliate you based on those false assumptions. Sarah studied Rebecca's face, trying to determine whether the apology was genuine or simply motivated by social pressure and fear of consequences. Rebecca, I appreciate your apology, but I want you to understand that this isn't really about me personally. Military service members and their families deal with these attitudes regularly. Your comments tonight reflect prejudices that affect thousands of people who have volunteered to serve our country. Rebecca nodded, her expression showing genuine remorse. You're right. I've never really thought about the sacrifices that military families make or the skills required for military service. Tonight has been a real education for me. Sarah's expression softened slightly. Unlike Jennifer, who seemed to be sorry only because she had chosen the wrong target, Rebecca appeared to genuinely understand that her attitudes and assumptions had been wrong. Military service isn't the right path for everyone, Sarah acknowledged. But people who choose to serve deserve respect for their willingness to put the needs of others ahead of their own comfort and safety. The hotel manager returned to the group, having consulted with hotel security and legal counsel about how to handle the situation. Commander Martinez, he said formally, having learned Sarah's rank from the conversations he had overheard. The hotel would be happy to press charges on your behalf for the assault that occurred. We have multiple witnesses and security camera footage of the incident. Sarah considered the offer carefully. Pressing charges would ensure that Jennifer faced legal consequences for her actions, but it would also prolong the situation and potentially turn the focus away from the broader issues about respect for military service. I appreciate your offer, Sarah replied. Let me think about it for a moment. She looked around the room at her former classmates, many of whom were still processing what they had witnessed and learned. The incident had clearly had an impact beyond just the immediate confrontation. People were talking about military service with new understanding and respect. Jennifer's friends had completely abandoned her, unwilling to be associated with someone who had behaved so poorly. Even Rebecca had moved away from the registration table, leaving Jennifer standing essentially alone with her husband. Robert Walsh, meanwhile, was dealing with his own crisis. As a prominent lawyer in their community, he understood that his wife's behavior would become public knowledge and could potentially affect his practice and their family's standing in town. "Jennifer," he said quietly but firmly, "we need to leave immediately. And tomorrow we're going to have a serious conversation about getting you some help with these attitudes and behaviors." But Sarah wasn't finished addressing the situation. She had used the incident as an opportunity to educate people about military service, but there were still important points to be made about character and accountability. "Before anyone leaves," she said in a voice that commanded attention, "I want to make sure everyone understands what really happened here tonight." The crowd turned to listen, recognizing that Sarah had something important to say. "What you witnessed wasn't just one person behaving badly toward another person. You witnessed the kind of prejudice and disrespect that military service members face regularly from civilians who make assumptions based on ignorance rather than facts." She looked directly at Jennifer as she continued. "Jennifer felt entitled to spit in my face because she assumed I was beneath her in some social hierarchy. She made that assumption based on her prejudices about military service and service members." The crowd listened in silence as Sarah made her broader point. "But here's what everyone needs to understand, even if I had been a junior enlisted sailor with no combat experience and no special training, Jennifer's behavior would have been equally wrong. Respect for service members shouldn't depend on their rank or their accomplishments, it should be based on their willingness to serve something larger than themselves." Several veterans in the crowd nodded in agreement, and other classmates began to understand the deeper implications of what they had witnessed. Every person in uniform, from the newest recruit to the most senior officer, deserves basic human respect. They've all volunteered to potentially sacrifice their lives for their country, and that volunteer commitment demands recognition regardless of their specific job or rank. Tommy Walsh stepped forward again. "Sarah's absolutely right. The disrespect we saw tonight is something that military families deal with all the time. People make assumptions about intelligence, capability, and worth based on their prejudices about military service." Sarah nodded at Tommy's support. And those prejudices don't just hurt. Sarah's words had created a moment of genuine reflection among her former classmates. The reunion, which had begun as a typical social gathering, had become an unexpected lesson about respect, service, and the consequences of prejudice and cruelty. Dr. Michael Chen stepped forward with obvious determination. As the former student body president and now a respected physician, his words would carry significant weight with many of the reunion attendees. "I want to say something to everyone here," he announced, addressing the entire room. "What we witnessed tonight was shameful, and all of us who stood by and watched it happen bear some responsibility." The crowd grew quiet as Michael continued his unexpected but necessary speech. "Sarah was subjected to cruel treatment based on ignorance and prejudice, and most of us did nothing to stop it. We allowed someone in our community to be humiliated because we were either too cowardly to intervene or because we shared some of the same prejudiced attitudes." His words hit hard because they forced people to examine their own behavior during the incident. Many classmates looked uncomfortable as they realized they had indeed stood by while someone was being mistreated. "But tonight also gave us an opportunity to learn something important about service, sacrifice, and character," Michael continued. Sarah could have responded to the disrespect she received in many different ways. She could have gotten angry, or walked away, or tried to prove herself through bragging about her accomplishments. He looked directly at Sarah with obvious admiration. Instead, she maintained her dignity and used the situation as an opportunity to educate all of us about military service and the importance of respect. That response shows more character than anything else I've witnessed tonight. The crowd murmured in agreement, and several people nodded their heads. Sarah's composed, educational response to extreme provocation had made a strong impression on everyone who witnessed it. Lisa Rodriguez stepped forward to add her own thoughts. Michael's right. I've been thinking about my own assumptions and attitudes, and I realize I've never really appreciated what military service involves or what military families sacrifice. She looked around at the crowd of former classmates. How many of us have ever taken the time to thank a service member or veteran for their service? How many of us have ever thought about the challenges military families face when loved ones are deployed to dangerous places? Her questions prompted quiet conversations throughout the room as people began examining their own relationships with and attitudes toward military service. Tommy Walsh, the Army veteran, appreciated the direction the conversation was taking. Lisa raises important points. The military-civilian divide in our country has grown over the years, partly because so many civilians have no personal connection to military service. He gestured toward Sarah. Meeting someone like Sarah, learning about her experiences and her dedication, helps bridge that divide. But it shouldn't take a dramatic confrontation like tonight to create that understanding. Sarah listened to these conversations with mixed emotions. She was pleased that her former classmates were beginning to think more deeply about military service and civilian-military relations. But she was also aware that Jennifer, who had caused the entire incident, was still standing nearby without showing any real understanding of why her behavior had been so wrong. "Jennifer," Sarah said, turning to address her directly again, "you've heard what people are saying about respect for military service and the importance of bridging civilian-military divides. Do you understand why your behavior tonight was so harmful?" Jennifer looked around desperately for support, but found none. Even her husband was maintaining his distance, clearly embarrassed and angry about the situation she had created. I said I was sorry," Jennifer replied weakly. "I didn't know you were. I mean, I didn't understand." Sarah's expression remained stern. "You're still missing the point, Jennifer. You're sorry because you chose the wrong target for your cruelty, not because cruelty itself is wrong." The distinction was important, and everyone listening understood it. Sarah was trying to help Jennifer understand the difference between regret over consequences and genuine remorse over behavior. "If I had been a junior enlisted sailor, or an Army private, or any other service member, would your behavior have been acceptable?" Sarah pressed. Jennifer's inability to answer the question clearly revealed that she still didn't fully understand the problem with her attitudes and actions. Robert Walsh, growing increasingly frustrated with his wife's failure to grasp the seriousness of the situation, stepped in. "Jennifer, answer the question. Would it have been acceptable to spit in the face of any service member, regardless of their rank or background?" The pressure from her husband, combined with the disapproving stares from everyone around her, finally forced Jennifer to confront the ugly truth about her behavior. "No," she whispered. "It wouldn't have been acceptable." Sarah nodded. "That's correct." "And why wouldn't it have been acceptable?" Jennifer struggled to find words, clearly uncomfortable with being forced to examine her own attitudes and behavior so publicly. Because they serve our country," she finally managed to say. "That's part of it," Sarah acknowledged. "But it's also because spitting on anyone is degrading and wrong, regardless of their profession or status. You treated another human being as if they were beneath your consideration and respect." The educational tone in Sarah's voice showed that she was still trying to help Jennifer understand rather than simply humiliate her in return. Military service members face unique challenges and make unique sacrifices, which is why they deserve special respect and appreciation, Sarah continued. But beyond that, they are human beings who deserve the same basic courtesy and dignity that everyone deserves. Dr. James Patterson, the surgeon who had asked thoughtful questions earlier, stepped forward with a suggestion. "Sarah, would you be willing to come speak at our hospital about military medicine and combat trauma? I think our staff would benefit greatly from learning about the medical challenges faced in combat situations." Sarah appreciated the offer and the opportunity it represented to continue educating people about military service. "I'd be happy to do that, Dr. Patterson. Military medical personnel do incredible work under extremely difficult conditions, and civilian medical professionals should understand the innovations and techniques that have been developed in combat medicine." Other classmates began making similar offers. Lisa Rodriguez invited Sarah to speak to her accounting firm's clients about financial planning for military families. Michael Chen asked if she would be interested in speaking to medical students about leadership under pressure. The transformation in the room was remarkable. What had begun with cruel mockery of military service was evolving into genuine interest in learning about and supporting service members and veterans. But Sarah wasn't ready to let the evening end on a purely positive note without ensuring that the serious issues raised by the incident were properly addressed. "I appreciate all of these offers, and I'm happy to help educate people about military service," she said. "But I want to make sure we don't lose sight of the broader problems that tonight's incident revealed." She looked around the room at the faces listening to her. The attitudes and prejudices that Jennifer expressed tonight aren't unique to her. They exist throughout our society, and they create real problems for service members, veterans, and their families. Tommy Walsh nodded in agreement. Sarah's right. Military families deal with employment discrimination, social isolation, and a general lack of understanding from civilian communities. These aren't individual problems, they are systemic issues that affect thousands of people. Sarah continued her broader analysis. When civilians view military service as a last resort for people who can't succeed elsewhere, it creates barriers to successful transition back to civilian life. Veterans face challenges in employment, education, and social integration partly because of these prejudiced attitudes. The crowd listened with growing understanding of issues they had never really considered before. Military spouses face unique challenges too, Sarah added. They deal with frequent moves, long deployments, and the stress of having loved ones in dangerous situations. When civilian communities don't understand or appreciate these sacrifices, it makes everything harder for military families. Dr. Chen spoke up. "Sarah, what can we as civilians do to better support military families and veterans in our community?" It was an important question that showed genuine desire to make positive changes based on the evening's lessons. "Education is the first step," Sarah replied. "Learn about military service, military culture, and the challenges faced by service members and their families. Don't make assumptions based on stereotypes or movies." She paused and looked around the room. "Second, create opportunities for meaningful interaction between civilian and military communities. Veterans and military families shouldn't be isolated in separate social circles, they should be integrated into the broader community." Lisa Rodriguez raised her hand. "What about employment? Are there specific things employers should know about hiring veterans?" Sarah appreciated the practical focus of the question. Veterans bring unique skills to civilian employment, leadership experience, ability to work under pressure, adaptability, and strong work ethic. But they also need support in translating military experience into civilian terms. Tommy Walsh added his perspective. "A lot of veterans struggle with the transition because civilian employers don't understand military training and experience. They see military service as irrelevant to civilian jobs instead of recognizing the valuable skills involved." The conversation was becoming increasingly productive, with people asking genuine questions and showing real interest in making positive changes. But Sarah noticed that Jennifer was still standing nearby, apparently waiting for the attention to shift away from her behavior. "Jennifer," Sarah said, bringing the focus back to the person who had caused the incident, "you've heard this conversation about supporting military families and veterans. What are you going to do differently going forward?" It was a direct challenge that forced Jennifer to articulate how she planned to change her attitudes and behavior based on the evening's events. Jennifer looked around nervously, clearly aware that everyone was watching and waiting for her response. I'll try to learn more about military service," she said hesitantly. Sarah's expression indicated that this vague promise wasn't sufficient. "That's a start, but what specific actions will you take to address the harm you've caused and the attitudes you've expressed?" Robert Walsh, growing impatient with his wife's continued failure to take real responsibility, stepped in again. "Jennifer, you need to make a public apology for your behavior and commit to specific actions to make amends," he said firmly. "This isn't going away with weak promises and vague statements." The pressure from her husband and the expectant stares from everyone around her finally forced Jennifer to make a more substantive response. "I'll make a donation to a veterans organization," she said. "And I'll volunteer with programs that support military families." Sarah studied Jennifer's face, trying to determine whether these commitments were genuine or simply motivated by social pressure and desire to escape consequences. "Those would be positive steps," Sarah acknowledged. "But they need to come." Jennifer stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her. The ballroom that had once felt like her social domain now felt like a courtroom where she was being judged by her peers for behavior that everyone recognized as deeply wrong. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Yes, I understand that my attitudes were wrong. I judged you and military service based on ignorance and prejudice, and I treated you horribly because I thought you were beneath me." Her admission created a moment of tense silence in the room. For the first time since the incident began, Jennifer seemed to be genuinely confronting her own behavior rather than simply trying to escape consequences. "I was cruel and disrespectful, and I'm ashamed of how I acted tonight," she continued, her voice growing steadier. "I will donate to veterans organizations and volunteer with military family support programs, but not just to repair my reputation. I need to learn about the sacrifices and dedication that military service involves." Sarah studied Jennifer's expression carefully, using the same assessment skills she employed in military situations to determine whether someone could be trusted. After a moment, she nodded slightly. "That's a more honest response, Jennifer. But understanding why your behavior was wrong is just the beginning. The real test will be whether you follow through on your commitments when no one is watching and the social pressure is gone." Robert Walsh looked at his wife with a mixture of disappointment and determination. "Jennifer, this incident has shown me attitudes and behaviors that I didn't know existed. We're going to counseling, and you're going to get help examining these prejudices and where they come from." The crowd watched as the couple dealt with the personal consequences of the evening's events. It was clear that Jennifer's behavior had created serious problems in her marriage beyond the public embarrassment and potential legal consequences. Dr. Michael Chen stepped forward to address the broader lessons of the evening. "I think all of us have learned important things tonight about respect, service, and the consequences of prejudice. But I want to make sure we don't just go back to our regular lives and forget these lessons." He looked around the room at his former classmates. "I propose that we establish a permanent scholarship fund in honor of military service members and their families. We could fund it through annual contributions from our class, and award scholarships to children of active duty military personnel or veterans." The proposal was met with immediate enthusiasm from many classmates. Lisa Rodriguez volunteered to handle the financial administration, while Tommy Walsh offered to help establish criteria for scholarship recipients. "That's an excellent idea," Sarah said. "But I'd also suggest partnering with local veterans organizations to identify other ways our community can support military families." Dr. James Patterson raised his hand. "I'm committed to hosting regular educational events at our hospital about military medicine and veterans' health issues. Sarah, would you help us organize the first event?" Sarah nodded. "Absolutely. And I think we should also invite other veterans and military families to share their experiences. The more people understand about military service, the better our community will be." The transformation in the room was remarkable. What had begun as a typical high school reunion marked by social cruelty had evolved into a planning session for community service and military support initiatives. But the evening's most important moment came when Maria Santos approached the group. Maria had been a quiet classmate in high school who had never been part of the popular social circles. She had been standing in the background throughout the incident, and now she stepped forward with obvious nervousness. "Sarah, I wanted to thank you for how you handled this situation tonight," Maria said quietly. "My brother served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the army, and he came home with injuries and trauma that our family is still dealing with." Her voice became stronger as she continued. "He's faced exactly the kind of attitudes and disrespect that Jennifer showed tonight. People assume he's damaged or incapable because of his military service and his struggles with PTSD. Your response tonight gave me hope that things can change. Sarah's expression softened as she listened to Maria's personal story. Thank you for sharing that, Maria. Your brother's service and sacrifice deserve recognition and respect, and his struggles with PTSD don't diminish his worth or capabilities. She looked around the room to address everyone listening. Mental health challenges from combat trauma are not signs of weakness or failure. They are evidence of people who served in extremely difficult conditions and need support to heal and transition back to civilian life. Tommy Walsh nodded emphatically. That's exactly right. Military mental health issues are medical conditions that require treatment and support, not judgment and discrimination. Maria wiped away a tear. It means so much to hear people say that. My brother has struggled with employment and relationships because people make assumptions about his stability and reliability based on his PTSD diagnosis. The conversation about military mental health opened up another important dimension of civilian-military understanding. Dr. Chen immediately committed to hosting educational events about combat trauma and veteran mental health at his hospital. As the evening progressed, more classmates shared personal connections to military service. Some had family members who had served, others had friends who were veterans, and a few had military spouses or children. The incident had created a space for these personal stories to be shared and for the community to recognize the military connections that had always existed but hadn't been acknowledged. Lisa Rodriguez approached Sarah with a business proposal. Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said regarding employment challenges for veterans. Would you be interested in working with my firm to develop a program for helping veterans translate their military experience into civilian career qualifications? Sarah was impressed by the practical focus of Lisa's suggestion. That's exactly the kind of initiative that could make a real difference. Veterans often have extensive leadership and technical experience that civilian employers don't recognize or understand. The hotel manager, who had been observing the transformation in the room's atmosphere, approached Sarah with an unexpected offer. Commander Martinez, our hotel chain has been looking for someone to develop training programs about serving military families and understanding military culture. Would you consider consulting with us on that project? Sarah was surprised but pleased by the business opportunity. I'd be very interested in discussing that. Military families have unique needs when they travel, especially during moves and deployments. The networking and collaboration opportunities emerging from the evening's incident were creating positive outcomes that no one could have anticipated when the reunion began. Jennifer, meanwhile, had been standing quietly with her husband, observing the community mobilization that had grown out of her cruel behavior. Finally, she approached Sarah one more time. Sarah, I know I have a lot of work to do to understand military service and examine my own prejudices, she said with obvious effort. Would you be willing to meet with me sometime to help me learn more about what military families need from their communities? Sarah considered the request carefully. Her instinct was to maintain distance from someone who had treated her so poorly, but she also recognized an opportunity to create genuine change in someone who clearly needed education about military service. I'm willing to have that conversation, Jennifer, but only if you're committed to honest self-examination and real change. This can't be about rehabilitating your image, it has to be about genuinely understanding why your attitudes were harmful. Jennifer nodded seriously. I understand. I need to do better, and I want to learn how. Robert Walsh looked at his wife with cautious optimism. This is a start, Jennifer, but you have a lot of work ahead of you to address these attitudes and behaviors. As the reunion began winding down, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn the evening had taken. She had come to reconnect with old classmates and perhaps catch up with a few friends. Instead, she had been subjected to cruel treatment that forced her to reveal her military background and educate an entire room of people about military service and respect. But the outcome had been overwhelmingly positive. A community that had been largely disconnected from military service was now actively planning ways to support veterans and military families. Prejudiced attitudes had been challenged and changed. Personal stories had been shared that created understanding and empathy. Tommy Walsh approached Sarah as people began saying their goodbyes. Sarah, Thank you for standing up for all of us tonight. What you did here will benefit every veteran and military family in this community. Dr. Chen joined them. I agree completely. You turned a terrible situation into an opportunity for education and positive change. That takes real character and wisdom. Sarah smiled at her former classmates. That's what military service teaches you, how to turn challenges into opportunities and how to focus on mission accomplishment even when conditions are difficult. Lisa Rodriguez handed Sarah her business card. Please stay in touch. I'm serious about working together on veteran employment initiatives, and I think our community is ready to do much better. As Sarah prepared to leave, she noticed Jennifer standing alone near the registration table. Her husband was talking to the hotel manager about potential legal consequences, and her former friends had made it clear they didn't want to be associated with her behavior. Sarah approached Jennifer one final time. Jennifer, tonight doesn't have to define you permanently, she said quietly. You have an opportunity to learn, grow, and become someone who contributes positively to military families and veterans. But that change has to be genuine and sustained. Jennifer looked up with tears in her eyes. Thank you for giving me that chance, Sarah. I don't deserve your kindness after what I did, but I'm grateful for it. Sarah nodded. Everyone deserves the opportunity to become better than they were. Use this experience to examine not just your attitudes about military service, but your attitudes about treating other people with respect and dignity. As Sarah walked toward the hotel exit, she reflected on the complex emotions of the evening. The incident had been painful and humiliating, but it had also created opportunities for education, community building, and positive change that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Admiral Morrison. Heard your reunion was eventful. Hope you taught some important lessons tonight. Sarah smiled as she typed her response, mission accomplished, sir. Community education successful, and multiple ongoing initiatives established. Outside the hotel, the night air was cool and refreshing after the intense atmosphere of the ballroom. Sarah looked up at the stars and thought about the teammates and fellow veterans who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. They deserved better from civilian communities than ignorance and disrespect. But tonight had proven that education and honest conversation could change hearts and minds. A community that had been largely indifferent to military service was now actively planning ways to honor and support those who serve. As Sarah drove home, she realized that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in hotel ballrooms where prejudice and respect clash in front of people who have the power to choose which values will define their community. The incident had ended not with victory over an enemy, but with the more important triumph of building bridges between civilian and military communities. And that, Sarah reflected, was a mission worth completing. Genuine understanding and remorse, not just from wanting to repair your reputation. She looked directly into Jennifer's eyes. Do you understand why your attitudes about military service were wrong, and are you committed to examining and changing those attitudes? Jennifer's response would determine whether the incident had truly created positive change or had simply forced superficial compliance with social expectations. Individual service members, they hurt our entire society by creating division between civilian and military communities that should be united in common purpose. The educational impact of Sarah's words was evident in the expressions of her former classmates. Many of them had never considered these broader issues about civilian-military relations and the importance of mutual respect and understanding. The hotel manager approached the group, having been alerted by staff members who had witnessed the incident. His expression was serious and professional as he addressed the situation. Excuse me, I understand there was an incident here involving assault. I need to ask the person responsible to leave the premises immediately. We do not tolerate the kind of behavior at our establishment. Jennifer's face went even whiter as she realized the consequences of her actions were expanding beyond social embarrassment to potentially serious legal and professional problems. That made several people in the crowd take an involuntary step backward. Jennifer, still riding high on her perceived victory, laughed dismissively. What are you going to do about it? Call your commanding officer? File a complaint. She turned to her friends with exaggerated amusement. Maybe she'll march around the room or do some push-ups. But, as Jennifer continued her mocking performance, she failed to notice that the atmosphere in the room had changed dramatically. The crowd was no longer watching with curious amusement, they were watching with the kind of tense attention that comes when people sense that a serious confrontation is about to unfold. Sarah Martinez had spent 20 years learning to control her responses to provocation and disrespect. She had faced enemies who wanted to kill her and had remained calm and professional. She had endured discrimination and doubt from people who questioned her abilities and had proven herself through actions rather than words. But Jennifer Walsh had just made the mistake of treating a United States Navy SEAL like a helpless victim who would accept abuse without consequence. And Sarah Martinez was about to teach her and everyone else in that ballroom exactly why that was such a dangerous assumption to make.